Hello, everyone. This week, we're going to take a look at two kinds of plants. These are called lower plants, mosses and ferns. They exhibit the same kind of life cycle that we talked about last week, an alternation of two generations, a haploid one called a gametophyte and a diploid one called a sporophyte. Now, we're going to take a look at those definitions again before we take a look at the life cycle of the actual mosses and ferns for this week's lab. Mosses are in the division Bryophyta. A division is at the same level of classification as phylum, it's right under kingdom. This is the kingdom plants and the division Bryophyta, which contains all the mosses. Now, again, for our review from last week, a haploid organism is any organism that has only one set of chromosomes or one set of all its genes. A diploid organism is one that has two sets of chromosomes created by the fusion of two cells, two haploid cells, fusing together with each one having one set. A haploid cell could be a sperm or an egg, and when they fuse together to form the zygote or fertilized egg, obviously it would have two sets of chromosomes, one set from the sperm and one set from the egg, and those are called diploid cells. The advantage of being diploid is because you have now two sets of two kinds of each gene in the cells of the organism, and so if one gene is in some kind of bad shape or in trouble or doesn't work right, the other one can back it up. So that's a nice backup set. That's why a diploid organism is a better deal. Mitosis is the replication of the cell's nucleus. If it's a haploid cell doing it, you'll create two haploid cells. If it's a diploid cell doing it, you'll create two diploid cells, all identical to each other. Meiosis is a very special kind of cell replication, where cells that are diploid can become cells that are haploid. Normally, this happens to create sperm and egg in animals, but in plants, it happens to create spores. And we'll see that the sporophyte is the one that does the meiosis to create the spores. Gametes are the sex cells, the eggs and the sperm. They're always haploid so that they can fuse together to form the diploid cells. Gametophytes are haploid organisms. Gametophytes are always haploid, and they produce haploid gametes. And so since you're going from haploid to haploid, it's mitosis. Spores are cells that can grow into an organism all by themselves. They don't need to be fertilized. They don't need to fuse with another cell like an egg or a sperm does. They can just grow right into something. And in plants, they're normally haploid. Sporophytes are diploid organisms, two sets of genes, and they produce haploid spores. But since they're going from diploid to haploid, then that's happening by meiosis, a reduction division from a diploid state to the haploid state, two sets of genes to one set of genes. A zygote is the fertilized egg. A sperm, when it fuses with an egg, becomes a zygote. And since zygotes are haploid sperm and haploid egg fused together, they are diploid. Here's a nice little example of an alternation of generations. If we start with the gametophyte down here, that gametophyte is haploid. It has only one set of genes. It will do mitosis someplace on it. And mitosis, of course, is just the replications of the cells, and they will create haploid gametes, haploid to haploid. The gametes are usually eggs and sperm. Let's say these are the eggs, and this guy over here is the sperm, maybe from another gametophyte. And they will fuse together to form the fertilized egg. And the fertilized egg is the zygote. One zygote is formed by the fusion of an egg and a sperm. Zygotes are diploid because of that. The zygote can do mitosis and grow into something. When it does that, it grows into a diploid organism because the zygote is diploid. And when it does, it grows into a sporophyte. Sporophytes are diploid plants that create haploid spores by meiosis. Phyte means plant, and obviously a sporophyte is a plant that makes spores. A gametophyte is a plant that makes gametes, eggs and sperm. The sporophyte will do meiosis someplace on it, and create haploid spores. And remember, spores can grow into something by themselves. And so each spore will grow into another gametophyte. And this keeps going round and round and round and round. And that's the life cycle of plants. Now let's see if we can apply this to mosses. Now this looks pretty big and fancy, but we'll do it one at a time here. When you look at mosses, this is what you see. When you look at the ground and you walk on some mosses, they're very, very small. They have to stay short because they have no vascular tissue. There's no transport system inside for the roots to pick up water and take it up the plant. So it has to take the water and nutrients from the rain. And so in order to get it from the rain and not dry out, they have to stay very, very, very small. And that's why they form these mats on the ground. Now, let's say this one is the female gametophyte and this one's the male gametophyte. So when you see a moss on the ground, you're looking at the gametophyte stage. They're haploid. They're one set of genes in each cell. If you take the female gametophyte and look on the top here with a microscope or a magnifying glass, you'll see these little structures sitting up on top of the female gametophyte, right on the top here. These are called archegonia. Archegonia are the female sex organs of the gametophyte. Remember, gametophytes make gametes. They make eggs and sperm. So you need sex organs to do that. And these are the archegonia, the female sex organs. They look like a little vase. And inside the archegonia, there's a little cell right down there, right where the little pointer is. And those are eggs. They're actual haploid eggs formed by mitosis by the gametophyte. Gametophytes are haploid organisms that make haploid eggs by mitosis. And let's leave those eggs in the archegonia for now, and then take a look at the male. The male gametophyte looks just like the female one. You really can't tell them apart unless you look at the tops. And the tops have the sex organs. And if it was a male, it would have a male sex organ. If it's a female, it would have a female sex organ. The male sex organ is called an antheridium. And you see, they look like little sort of ovals sitting on top of the male gametophyte plant. When it rains, the raindrops fall down onto them and actually burst them open. And inside of the antheridia are the sperm. Remember, this is a gametophyte. It makes sperm by mitosis. And so sperm gametes actually then swim out of the antheridia in the rain. That's why these mosses live in basically moist, wet habitats. They need the water for the sperm to swim in and to stay wet. The sperm are actually green, a little photosynthetic sperm, and they swim around with their undulapodia or flagella. And you'll see here they are in a sort of magnified form up here in the top here. And this is an archegonia showing a lot bigger one and a little magnified. The sperm is going to swim down the archegonia neck and fertilize that egg. It's actual sex happening right on the lawn in front of your house as the sperm and the egg fuse together after a nice little rainstorm in the spring. When the sperm fuses with an egg, it becomes a zygote. And the zygote is obviously the fertilized egg, and it's sitting inside that female sex organ. In a sense, she's getting pregnant here. And that zygote is the baby. It's a little diploid baby, 2 sets of genes and a fertilized egg. Now, zygotes grow into sporophytes. That's what they do. And so if you look at the next area here, you see that zygote is starting to do mitosis here and grow into many, many cells. And that's going to grow up through the neck of the archegonia and create this sort of stick, looks like a lollipop coming out of the archegonia with a little ball on top. This is the sporophyte. The sporophyte of a moss is just nothing more than a sort of a stick-like structure sticking straight out of the archegonia and with a little ball on the top. That ball is called a sporangium because that's where the meiosis happens to create spores. Remember, sporophytes are diploid organisms that make spores by meiosis. And so these spores will form inside this sporangium or area to do meiosis to make spores. And here's the meiosis happening. And these are the what it looks like. If you actually look at the mosses on your lawn after it rains in the spring, you actually should see some of these sporophytes sticking up out of it. These sporophytes are diploid. The moss underneath is the gametophyte. She's haploid. So the sporophytes and the gametophytes kind of live together here. And the sporangium is going to do meiosis to create spores. The spores are going to come out of the sporangia as this little cap opens up, and the spores will fall onto the ground. And these spores are all haploid because they were formed by meiosis. Meiosis changes diploid cells to haploid ones, and those spores will land on the ground and start to grow into a gametophyte again. Remember, spores are haploid. They're going to grow into the haploid phase. And the haploid phase, remember, was the thing we started with here, the little moss gametophytes. That spore will go into something that looks just like green algae, and it will eventually, and that's called a protonema or a protonemata. That's just the beginning growth stage of the spore. And then it's going to develop into the area. You see this, the little gametophyte starting to grow out of that. And here it is where we started from. And this is the cycle. Now let's take a look at each step one at a time. Okay. If you look at the cycle here, you see the female gametophyte, the male gametophyte. These are what you notice on your lawn, on the ground. These are what you would call mosses. It's the gametophyte stage. Gametophyte stage, the female will have archegonia on top, and the male will have antheridia on top. This is an actual photograph of some archegonia. And you can see they look like little vases. They have this little area that the sperm has to swim down. And that cell down there at the bottom, that's the egg right there. Okay. In the male, this is the male sex organ, and all these little things are sperm forming inside the antheridia. The eggs formed by mitosis, and the sperm forms on mitosis because it's haploid to haploid. The gametophyte is haploid, the sperm are haploid, the eggs are haploid. And then what's going to happen? It's going to rain. The rain is going to bang into the antheridia. It's going to burst them open. The sperm are going to swim out into the wet ground and swim down into the neck of the archegonia. One sperm will fertilize the egg, and you'll end up with a zygote. In other words, you have a female sex organ here with a baby inside, and the baby is the zygote, the fertilized egg. And then the zygote is going to grow into a sporophyte. The zygote's diploid. It's going to grow into the sporophyte stage, and the sporophyte stage is the diploid part of the life cycle. That's going to grow into this structure here that looks like a lollipop. It's a stick coming straight out of the female sex organ, going from the zygote down here at the bottom, with that little sporangium on the top. The sporangium is the part of the cell that does meiosis. And you can see here, these are actual sporangia, or actually sporophytes growing up out of the mosses. These are the female mosses down here. And then there's males, of course, and the males don't have anything coming out of them. But the females have the babies coming out. And these are they. These are the sporophytes with the little sporangium on top. And they will eventually grow into that. Now, what happens next is that the spores are going to come out of the sporangium, grow into that little protonema stage that looks like this, and that's going to grow into the mosses again that you saw at the beginning. Okay, and that's basically the life cycle. It's a very simple life cycle. It goes round and round and round and round like this, and it just keeps happening and happening, and you end up more and more mosses in the world. Now, when you get to ferns, ferns are a little bit different. They're pterophyta. Pterophyta is the division that ferns are in within the kingdom of plants. And if there they are, of course, you recognize a fern when you see one. So when you look at a fern like this, you're looking at a fern that is diploid. This is the sporophyte stage. When you look at a moss on the ground, that's the gametophyte. But when you look at a fern, you're looking at the sporophyte. Now, here's the life cycle of a fern. It's very, very simple. It's very similar to the one of the moss, but it just looks a lot different. What you recognize as a fern, this thing, that's the sporophyte stage. It's diploid. It has two sets of genes. And because of that, it can become more complex. Remember, diploid cells have backup sets of genes. So if there's any genes that aren't working properly, the other set that it got from its other parent can back that up. So you can get more complex if you're diploid. That's why our bodies are diploid. And the only haploid cells we have are eggs and sperm. Now, if you have this diploid organism that we call a fern, someplace on it, if it's a sporophyte, which it is, it's going to have to make spores. And it makes spores by meiosis. So you're looking for a place where that happens. And what you do is you look under the leaves right under them. Now, if you look at a fern from the top, you don't see them. But if you pick the fern leaf up and look underneath it, you would see these little structures that look like little dots on the underside of the fern leaf. These little structures are called sori, or S-O-R-I, and singular of that is a sorus, and that's sitting underneath this fern leaf. Um, Inside the sorus, you see these little structures that look a lot like those little sporangia that you saw on the top of the sporophyte of the moss. And they are sporangia, that's what they are. And so what's happening in these sporangia is meiosis to create spores. Diploid sporophyte doing meiosis to create haploid spores. The spores are flung out of the sporangia. They actually fly them out. They throw them out into the ground. Each spore is now a haploid and can grow into something by itself. And as we know, spores grow into gametophytes. They are haploid. They grow into the haploid phase. Now, a gametophyte of a moss a fern looks absolutely nothing like sporophyte. This is the gametophyte. It's very, very small. This would be the size of like your fingernail. It looks big in the diagram here because I just drew it that way, but it is very, very small. It is the size of, let's say, your pinky fingernail. And on this structure, you see sex organs. The rhizoids are root-like structures that kind of hold it down into the ground, and these are the sex organs. Some of them are antheridia, which is the male sex organ, and some of them are archegonia, which is the female sex organ, the same names we used in the mosses. It could be this particular fern can have antheridia and archegonia on the same gametophyte. And what happens in the male antheridia is that mitosis occurs to create sperm, and the sperm will, they're haploid, they'll swim out, and they'll find an archegonia and swim down into it. And when they do that, they create the fertilized egg. Now, the fertilized egg will grow inside the archegonia, just like it did in the mosses. That fertilized egg will become the sporophyte, and just like it did in the mosses. But the sporophyte in ferns looks nothing like the thing in moss. The moss one was just a stick with a ball on top, a sporangium on top. This one is going to grow into the entire, what we'd recognize as a fern. And what's going to happen is this zygote here, this fertilized egg, syngamy is the same thing as fertilization. And what's going to happen is the fertilized egg will start to grow into a new sporophyte. And it's going to come straight out of that gametophyte. They'll actually grow right out of the females here and become the new generation of ferns. And you notice here that there's no seeds or anything like that. There's no pollen. It's just the same life cycle as a moss, except that it looked very much different. You do have a diploid sporophyte making haploid spores by meiosis. Spores are formed in these sori, or little dots underneath the leaves. The sporangia in the sori will fling out the spores. Each spore will grow into a gametophyte, which is also called a prothallus, and the gametophyte will have sex organs on it. Very, very small gametophyte. Looks nothing like the sporophyte. You'd probably overlook it if you were walking around in the woods. And on the gametophyte, there's male and female sex organs. Archegonia for male, archegonia for female, antheridia for male. The antheridium will make sperm by mitosis. The archegonium will make the egg by mitosis, and the sperm and egg will fuse together, syngamy or fertilization, and the fertilized egg will then grow back into the fern again. Now, these are the sporophytes. You see, you recognize this as a sporophyte. That's the fern that you see, a diploid organism. If you cut a fern stem, you see something that you don't see in mosses, and that's these guys. These are called vascular tissues. A vascular tissue is a tissue that has to do with transport. And so these areas on the outside here are going to transport sugars and things, food, and this big ones inside are going to transport water. And because we have a transport system for food and a transport system for water, ferns can get a lot bigger than mosses. Mosses do not have these. This is what they look like under a microscope. These are the sugary parts that actually are called phloem in plants that transport the sugary materials up or down the stem to feed the roots. The leaves of the fern do the photosynthesis and create sugar, and then this goes down to feed the roots, keep them alive under the ground. This is the xylem. The xylem are cells that actually are able to transport water up the stem so that the leaves up top can get way above the rainwater and still stay wet and get way bigger than the mosses do. These are the actual sori. Now, if you look underneath the leaves of a fern, you'll see these brownish dots, and these brownish dots are the actual sori. Inside of them are the sporangia that does meiosis to make the spores. Remember, the fern is a sporophyte, and so it does meiosis to make spores, and it does that inside these sori. This is one under a microscope, and you can see sori are filled with sporangia. All of these are structures that meiosis happens in to create spores, and the spores are going to be flying out of there when they're ready to go. This is another one. If you look at the fern sideways, you'll see underneath it, this would be a dot, and the sporangia would be inside of that. And this is an actual one. This is the fern leaf here. This is the actual leaf. And underneath the leaf is the sorus. And inside the sorus are these sporangia that actually will fling the spores out so the spores can grow into gametophytes. Here they are doing that. You can see them flinging those spores out. And these are the sporangia within the sori. And there's one actually doing it. These are the spores right here. These are fern spores. They're haploid, and they're created by mitosis within the sporangia, which lives in those little dots under the leaves called sori. This is a fern spore. It's going to be able to grow into a haploid gametophyte because spores are haploid and they grow into gametophytes. Here it is actually germinating. The spore is growing into a gametophyte. It's starting to grow into a male or a female gametophyte. In some ferns, a gametophyte that has male and female sex organs on it. This is what the gametophyte looked like. Remember, it was just a little thing about the same size as your fingernail. This is an actual one right here. And you can see next to the calculator how small it is. And this is another actual one. And on this one, you could actually see the antheridia and the archegonia. These are the sex organs on the gametophyte. And this one's making eggs, and this one's making sperm by mitosis. These are actual gametophytes. Now, you'd never notice them. They're very inconspicuous, and they just live on the forest floor having sex. And then they will just grow into the sporophyte once the fertilized egg is formed, and the fertilized egg will then grow into the sporophyte. Okay, now here is the gametophyte. This is an antheridium with sperm inside. This is an archegonia with an egg down here at the bottom. And what's going to happen is that the sperm will come out of the male sex organs, the antheridia, and dive down into the archegonia and fertilize the egg. And here it is growing into a sporophyte. The fertilized egg is going to grow as diploid, obviously. It's egg and sperm fused together. It's going to grow into the diploid phase, which is what we would know as a fern. And it's going to grow straight out of that archegonia and actually kill the gametophyte. It'll get so big, it'll just destroy the gametophyte. This is an actual female gametophyte with a sporophyte starting to grow out of its archegonia. This is a baby fern here. And this is the way the ferns actually unfold their leaves. They look like little fiddleheads. And that's the life cycle of a fern. And there is a nice little picture of a sporophyte. I hope that helped you. There's going to be an assignment on this. It's not going to be a quiz this time. It's just going to be an assignment. Just look for it on Blackboard and take it and do it by the date that it's due. Hope you have fun doing that. Now we're going to stop the recording now, and we'll see you next week.